"I have no family left," she whispered. "My kids have been waiting for a mother." He said the way a man says something he has never once let himself think in full sentences, the way a fence post finally gives after years of leaning the same direction. Somewhere behind him, in a house he had built with his own hands and had not finished building in all the ways that mattered, 2 children were waiting for supper, and neither of them yet knew that everything was about to change. That comes later. Hold on to it. We're going back to where this started, because you have to understand what an ordinary Tuesday looked like in that house before you can understand what it meant for it to stop being ordinary. Caleb Whitfield had been asked a great many questions in the 4 years since his wife died. Whether the girls were eating enough, whether the wheat was going to come in before the weather turned, whether he thought about hiring a housekeeper, because a man alone with 2 children and 400 acres was, in the opinion of nearly everyone in Millbrook, stretched about as thin as a man could be stretched without something giving. He had answers for all of it. Fine, he'd say. We're managing. The Lord provides. He had gotten good at answers that ended conversations rather than started them, and the town, for the most part, had learned to accept the answers and let him be, because Caleb Whitfield was not a man who invited more than he offered. What nobody asked, because it did not occur to anyone to ask it, was whether he was lonely. A man with 2 children and a working farm did not have the leisure to be lonely, or so the thinking went. He got up before the sun most mornings. He came in after dark most nights, and there was always something requiring his hands. A fence, a field, a fever in one of the girls, a leak in the roof that worsened every time it rained, and that he kept meaning to fix and kept not fixing, because fixing it meant standing on a ladder outside his own house at dusk with nothing to do but think. And thinking was the one thing Caleb Whitfield had built his entire life around avoiding. There was a chair at the kitchen table that nobody sat in. He had never said this out loud to anyone, not even to himself in so many words. But he set 4 places at supper every night out of a habit that had outlived his reason 3 years ago. And every night he moved the 4th plate to the sideboard before he called the girls in to eat, so that it would look, for just a moment before he corrected it, like the table was still set for a family of 4. He told himself it was easier than remembering not to set it. That was not the truth. And some part of him knew it was not the truth, and that part of him did not say anything, because there was wheat to bring in, and a roof that leaked, and 2 girls who needed their father more than he needed to sit with feeling he didn't have a name for. The girls were Ruth, who was 9, and Sarah, who was 6. Ruth still asked about her mother. Not often. She had learned, the way children learn things nobody teaches them directly, that the question made her father go quiet in a particular way, his jaw working like he was chewing on something that wouldn't go down. But every few weeks, usually at night, usually when he was tucking the quilt around her the way her mother used to do it, Ruth would ask something small and specific. Did Mama like the color blue? Did Mama sing the same songs Ruth sang? Was Mama's hair the same color as Ruth's? Because Ruth couldn't remember anymore and didn't want to forget the wrong thing. Sarah did not ask anymore. She had been 2 when her mother died, and whatever memories she might have carried had gone the way early memories go, and somewhere around her 4th birthday she had simply stopped bringing it up, not out of grief, but out of child's plain and devastating logic. There was no answer coming, so there was no reason to keep asking the question. Caleb told himself this was easier. He told himself a great many things were easier than they actually were, and this was one more entry on a list he did not examine too closely. That was the house. That was the 400 acres and the 2 girls and the 5th plate that never quite made it to the table. That was Caleb Whitfield's whole world, arranged and rearranged into a pattern that worked, more or less, on most days, and that he had stopped expecting to change. And then a woman named Eleanor Hayes came to Millbrook on the Thursday stage, and the pattern started coming apart before anyone, including her, understood that it was happening. She did not arrive with any fanfare, because there was no fanfare to be had in a town the size of Millbrook. She stepped down off the stage with 1 trunk and a hat box and the tired, careful posture of someone who had traveled a long way on very little sleep, and she walked directly into the mercantile and asked Ida Kessler, who ran the counter and knew everything there was to know about everyone within 20 miles, whether the town had need of a seamstress. It did. Millbrook had needed a seamstress for the better part of 2 years. since old Mrs. Applewhite's eyes had gotten too poor for close work, and within a week Eleanor Hayes had set up in the small room behind the mercantile that Ida rented out for exactly this purpose. And within 2 weeks half the women in town had found some reason to bring her something: a hem, a torn cuff, a wedding dress that needed letting out, not because the garment strictly required her attention, but because they wanted an excuse to sit with her for 20 minutes and take her measure. What they found, and what they reported back to their husbands and their neighbors with particular thoroughness small towns reserve for anyone new, was this: she was quiet in a way that wasn't shy. She listened like she meant it. She had a way of noticing a person's hands, or their shoes, or the way they held themselves, and saying something small and exactly right about it. The kind of observation that made a woman feel seen rather than examined. And she never once, in 2 weeks of fittings and fabric and idle mercantile conversation, mentioned a husband, a family, or where exactly she had come from for the Thursday stage, which in a town like Millbrook was its own kind of statement. And everyone noticed it, and nobody asked, at least not yet. Caleb heard about her the way he heard about most things secondhand and without much interest, from Walt Prue at the feed store, who mentioned that the new seamstress had fixed his wife's good coat. So well you couldn't find a tear, and that she'd done it for half what she should have charged because she said the coat looked warm and Mrs. Pruitt looked cold. Caleb nodded, said that was decent of her, and went back to loading feed sacks onto his wagon, and did not think of it again for the better part of a week. The first time he saw her, he did not know it was her. He was in town on a Saturday to sell eggs and buy nails, and there was a woman on the church steps talking to Reverend Cole about mending the choir robes. And Caleb noticed her only the way a man notices anything unfamiliar in a place he knows too well, a bee of attention, gone as quickly as it came. He did not learn her name that day. He did not speak to her. He loaded his wagon and drove the girls home and thought, if he thought of it all, that there was a new woman in town, which was neither here nor there to a man with 400 acres and a supper to get on the table. The second time, he still did not speak to her, though he came closer than he realized. Ruth had torn the hem of her good dress, climbing the fence behind the Kessler's place, and Caleb, who could patch a harness and mend a fence but had never in his life successfully threaded a needle, brought both girls into town on a Wednesday with the vague intention of asking Ida whether she knew anyone who could fix it before Sunday. Ida, naturally, sent him straight to the little room behind the mercantile, and Caleb, feeling the particular discomfort of a man doing something outside his competence, knocked on the door and found himself explaining the situation to a woman he had seen once from a distance on the church steps. She took the dress from Ruth with a gentleness that made the girl's shoulders come down half an inch, the way a child relaxes around someone who is not going to hurry them. She asked Ruth what color thread she liked, even though the tear was in a scene that would show to no one but Ruth herself, and Ruth, who did not usually warm to strangers, said blue, because blue was her favorite, and the woman said blue was an excellent choice and that she happened to have exactly the right shade. Caleb said he'd come back Friday. She said Friday would be fine. That was the whole conversation. He did not learn much more than her name, Eleanor, and he drove the wagon home telling himself he had learned nothing at all worth remembering, which was, he would come to understand much later, one more small untruth on a list that was quietly, without his noticing, getting longer. He came back on Friday to collect the dress, and she was not there. A fitting had run long across town, and Ida told him to come back the next morning, and so he did not see her again that week, and told himself this did not matter, and found himself 3 separate times over following days, thinking about a woman who had asked a 6-year-old what color thread she wanted for a seam nobody would ever see. What Caleb did not know, because there was no reason for anyone to tell him, and because Eleanor Hayes was not in the habit of offering it, was that the trunk she had carried off the Thursday's stage held, folded at the very bottom beneath 2 dresses, and a Bible that had belonged to her mother, a small tintype photograph of a man and a boy who did not exist anymore, and that Eleanor Hayes had come to Millbrook not because the town needed a seamstress, though it did, but because she had run out of places that reminded her of them, and had pointed at a map with her eyes closed, and Millbrook was where her finger had landed. She did not tell this to Ida Kessler, who would have listened with her whole heart. She did not tell it to Reverend Cole, who asked gently once whether she had family she left behind, and to whom she said only that she did not, in a voice that closed the subject as firmly as a door. And she certainly did not tell it to the quiet rancher who had brought his daughter's torn dress into her little room behind the mercantile and stood there, hat in his hands, looking like a man unaccustomed to asking anyone for anything. The dress came back finished on Saturday. The tear mended so well Ruth declared it better than new. The seam done in a blue that matched exactly. Caleb thanked her, paid her, and left, and that would have been the entire and unremarkable end of it, except that the following Tuesday, driving past the schoolhouse on his way to mill, he saw her again, this time in the schoolyard of all places, kneeling in the dirt beside Sarah Whitfield, who had scraped her knee badly enough to be crying, and who did not, as a rule, let strangers near her when she was crying. Caleb pulled the wagon up short at the fence line, close enough to see and not be seen, because something about the scene stopped him before he could think better of it. Eleanor had a handkerchief pressed gently to Sarah's knee, and she was talking to her in a low, unhurried voice, the kind of voice that did not rush a child to her tears, but walked alongside them. Caleb could not hear the words from where he sat. He would learn them later, much later, and they would matter more than almost anything else that was said to him that whole year. But from the wagon, in that moment, all he could see was his daughter, his silent daughter, his daughter who had stopped asking about her mother because the asking had never once been rewarded, leaning, without seeming to decide to, into a stranger's shoulder. Sarah had not leaned into anyone like that since her mother died. Caleb knew this the way a man knows the exact way of thing he carries every day and has never once set down. He sat in the wagon with the reins slack in his hands and watched the woman he had spoken to exactly twice kneel in the dirt of the schoolyard and give his daughter something he had not managed to give her in 4 years. Not because he didn't love her enough, but because grief had made him careful in all the wrong places, and this woman, this stranger, was not careful at all. She was simply present, entirely and without reservation, in a way that asked nothing and gave everything. He did not get down from the wagon. He told himself later that there was no reason to intrude, that Sarah was already calming, that a rancher climbing down to hover over his daughter and a seamstress in the middle of the schoolyard would only have made a scene of something that didn't need to be won. All of that was true. None of it was the real reason. The real reason was that he did not trust what his face would do if he got close enough to see it, and Caleb Whitfield had spent 4 years making very sure nobody saw what his face did. He clicked the reins and drove on to the mill, and did not mention what he had seen to anyone, and told himself he would not think of it again, and thought of almost nothing else for the rest of the day. It was 3 days later, at the mercantile, buying thread for men that did not strictly need doing, that he ran into her again, an encounter he would later admit, though not for a long while, had not been entirely accidental. They talked for longer than either of them intended, the way conversations do when neither person is watch and clock, about nothing in particular, the weather turning, the church social coming up, whether the Pruitt's new roof will hold for winter, and it was easy in a way conversation had not been easy for Caleb in longer than he could comfortably measure. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, with no clear lead-up, Eleanor said, "I came to Millbrook because I needed somewhere that didn't." She stopped. It was not a dramatic stop. It was small, almost nothing, the kind of pause a person might not even notice in an ordinary conversation between two people who did not yet know each other well enough to notice the shape of what wasn't being said. But Caleb noticed it, the way a man who has spent 4 years guarding his own silences learns to recognize the sound of someone else guarding one of theirs. She smiled a moment later and said something about the fabric she'd ordered, and the conversation moved on, easy as water finding its way around a stone. And if Caleb had been a particular kind of man, he was a man who had learned exactly what an unfinished sentence costs a person to leave unfinished. He might not have thought anything more of it at all, but he did think of it. He thought of it the whole ride home, past the schoolhouse, past the church, out along the road that ran toward the 400 acres and the house with the fifth plate, that never made it to the table. She had started to tell him why she'd come to Millbrook, and then she hadn't. She hadn't finished the sentence, and Caleb Whitfield had spent the better part of a week not finishing it either, in his head, in a dozen different directions, none of which he was proud of and none of which he could quite put down. It was Ruth who brought them back together, though she never knew it, and never would have believed it if you told her, because 9-year-olds do not generally understand that fetching a forgotten hair ribbon from the mercantile counts as matchmaking. Ruth had left the ribbon on Eleanor's work table the week before, during the fitting for the mended dress, and she asked her father on a Thursday evening, with the particular insistence of a child who has decided something is urgent, whether they could go and get it back before Sunday, because it was her good ribbon, the blue one, and she wanted to wear it to church. Caleb told himself there was nothing more to the trip than a ribbon. He told the girls the same thing. He believed it about as much as they did, which is to say not entirely, though none of the three of them said so out loud. They found Eleanor in the little room behind the mercantile with the last of the afternoon light coming low and gold through the single window, sitting very still at her work table with a letter open in front of her and her hands folded on top of it, not reading it, just sitting with it. The way a person sits with something after the reading is already done and the sitting is what's left. She looked up when the bell over the door announced them, and she smiled and found the ribbon exactly where Ruth had left it, and the visit might have ended there, ordinary and brief, except that Caleb sent the girls out ahead of him to wait by the wagon, Ruth to admire her ribbon in the wagon side mirror, Sarah because Ruth was going, and Sarah went wherever Ruth went, and found himself, for reasons he could not have explained, depressed, still standing in the doorway. "Bad news?" he asked, nodding at the letter, and immediately felt he'd overstepped. A man who had known this woman for a matter of weeks asking after a private mail like he had some claim to it. She looked down at the letter as though she'd forgotten it was there. "My aunt's house," she said, "in Ohio. It's been sold." She said it plainly, the way a person reports a fact about the weather, and Caleb, who had learned a great deal in his life about the distance a plain voice can put between a person and what they're actually saying, did not mistake the plainness for the whole of it. "My aunt raised me," Eleanor said, still looking at the letter and not at him, "after my parents passed. And when she died last spring, there wasn't anyone left to keep the house, so it sold. And the lawyer's letter says I'm to come and collect what's left of her things or they'll be given to charity. And I keep meaning to write back and tell him to give it all away, because there is a single thing in that house I need, and I haven't managed to write the letter." She folded it once, along its original crease, and set it beside her sewing basket with a care that seemed entirely out of proportion to a piece of paper she had just said she didn't need. "I had a husband," she said in the same plain voice, "and a boy, 4 years old. Fever took them both inside of a week, back in '81. There isn't a grave I visit, because we were living in Kansas at the time and I couldn't afford to bring them home, and my aunt was the last person left who remembered either of them the way I remember them, and now she's gone too, and the house is sold, and I don't." She stopped there. The second time in 2 weeks, she had stopped in the exact same place, at the exact same kind of sentence, and Caleb understood, standing in that doorway with the low gold light falling across her work table, that this was not a woman circling to her secret. This was a woman who had run entirely out a certain kind of sentence, and did not yet have a new one to put in its place. He did not offer comfort. He would tell you himself later that he did not know how, that comfort had never been a language he spoke with any confidence, not even to his own children in their worst nights. What he said instead was, "What day does a lawyer need an answer by?" She looked up at him, surprised by the question, the way a person is surprised when someone responds to a wound plan instead of a platitude. "The 15th, she said. "That's 11 days, Caleb said. "I'll write to a man I know in Dayton. Does freight work. Hauls estate goods for folks who can't travel to collect them themselves. He'll go through the house, box up anything with your aunt's handwriting on it or your mother's, and ship it here instead of to a stranger's parlor. You don't have to go back there. You don't have to decide today what you want kept and what you don't. You just have to let somebody else carry the part that doesn't need your heart in it, so you can keep the rest of it for when you're ready." He said all of this the way he might have laid out a plan for bringing in a field before a storm, practical, sequence, entirely without drama. And it was, without either of them naming it as such, the single kindest thing anyone had done for Eleanor Hayes in over a year. She did not cry. She would tell him much later that she had wanted to and hadn't quite been able to, that something in her had gone dry sometime around the fever in Kansas, and hadn't come back wet since, but that standing in that little room with the light going gold and a rancher she barely knew offering to solve a problem she hadn't asked him to solve. Something in her chest had moved for the first time in longer than she could measure. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you it's done, so you can put the letter down and stop carrying it around like it's still waiting on you." She looked at him for a long moment, in the particular quiet way of a person taking the measure of somebody they had assumed, Up until that exact moment, they had already finished taking a measure of, "Thank you," she said, finally, and it came out smaller than she meant it to. He touched his hat and went out the wagon, where Ruth was still admiring her ribbon, and Sarah was watching the street with the patient stillness of a 6-year-old who has learned to wait without complaint. And he did not think, driving home in the last of the light, that he had done anything more than a decent man does for a neighbor in a hard spot. It would be some while yet before he understood that he had, in fact, just told a grieving woman that her grief was not something she had to carry alone, and that this, more than any declaration he would eventually make, was the moment she started letting him in. It happened 3 weeks later, on the last Sunday of October, on the church steps, in a particular gold light that comes right before Montana winter closes its hand around a season for good. The freight man in Dayton had done his work. 2 crates had arrived on the Tuesday stage, addressed to Eleanor Hayes, care of the Millbrook Mercantile, and she had opened them alone, late at night by lamplight, and found her aunt's Bible and her mother's good silver spoon, and a small wooden box of letters tied with string that she had not yet had the courage to untie. She had not told Caleb any of this. She had thanked him, briefly, the following Sunday, and he had nodded and said he was glad it had gone smoothly, and neither of them had said anything more about it, because there are some kindnesses that do not require further conversation to be understood by both people as exactly what they were. But something had shifted, the way it shifts when one person hands another the practical part of burden and asks for nothing in return. Eleanor found herself, in the weeks that followed, arranging small reasons to see the Whitfield girls, a ribbon that needed retying, a dress that needed letting out an inch for growing, and Caleb found himself, in the same weeks, arranging small reasons to be in town on the days he knew she'd be at the Mercantile, and both of them told themselves separately that these were coincidences, the way 2 people will go on calling something a coincidence long after it has stopped being one. That last Sunday in October, after service, the congregation spilled out onto the church steps the way it did every week, into knots of conversation about the harvest and the coming winter, and Caleb found himself standing near Eleanor at the edge of the crowd, the girls off chasing the Pruitt boy's dog around the churchyard, and there was a pause between them, the comfortable kind, the kind that had grown up between them over these past weeks, without either one deciding to grow it. "I keep thinking about the boxes," Eleanor said, quietly, not quite looking at him. "I haven't been able to open the letters yet. I keep telling myself tomorrow." "There's no clock running on it," Caleb said. "Open them when you're ready. Or don't. Either one's allowed." She was quiet for a moment, watching the girls run, watching Ruth's blue ribbon catch the light as she turned. "I have no family left," she whispered. She did not say it the way a person announces a fact. She said it the way a person finally sets down something they've been carrying so long they stop feeling its weight, right up until the moment they put down and feel, all at once, how heavy it actually was. The words came out smaller than the sentence deserved and truer for it, and Caleb Whitfield, who had spent 4 years guarding his own silences with the same fierce carefulness she had spent guarding hers, felt something in his chest come loose that he had not given himself permission to feel in longer than he could measure. A hawk crossed the sky above the churchyard, the way it does in this country in the low light before winter, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and the girl's laughter carried across the yard from somewhere near the fence line, bright and unaware of the exact size of the moment happening 20 feet away. "My kids have been waiting for a mother," Caleb said. He had not planned to say it. He would tell you, if you asked him afterward, that he had not once let himself think the sentence all the way through before that moment, that it had arrived the way the truth arrives when a person finally stops guarding the door it's been standing behind. It was not a proposal. It was not even, strictly, an offer. It was simply the truest thing he had said out loud in 4 years, delivered as plainly as he had once told her the 11 days until the lawyer's deadline, and it landed in the space between them with the weight of everything neither of them had said until now. Eleanor did not answer. She looked at him for a long moment, an expression on her face that was not quite surprise, and not quite anything Caleb had a name for. Something closer to a woman hearing a door open in a house she'd long since stopped checking for doors. And then she looked away, toward the girls, toward the darkening line of the mountains beyond the churchyard fence, and said very quietly that she should collect the girls' things before it got too cold, and walked toward them across the yard without, waiting for him to say anything more. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said nothing at all, and Caleb stood on the church steps and watched her go and understood, with a particular clarity that comes to a man a beat too late, that he had just said the truest thing of his life to a woman who was not yet ready to hear it, and that there was nothing left to do now but wait and see whether she came back around to it, or whether he had just handed her one more thing to carry out of town she might, after all, decide to leave. She did not sleep that night. She sat at her work table long after the lamp should have been put out, the 2 crates from Dayton still half unpacked in the corner of the room, and she thought about a rancher's plain, unhurried voice saying his kids had been waiting, and she thought about the boy she had buried in her mind 1,000 times because she couldn't bury him anywhere else. And she thought about how a person who has run out of family does not get to simply acquire a new one the way you replace a broken plate. And somewhere in the middle of all that thinking, without deciding to, she untied the string on the box of letters for the first time and began, at last, to read. Before we go any further, I want to pause here for just a moment. From the Carolinas to the coast of Maine, from the plains of Kansas to the hills of Kentucky, wherever you're listening tonight. Thank you for riding along this far. If this story has found you at the right moment, a like helps more than you think. And I'd love to know where you tonight. Drop your town, your state, your country, whatever you're comfortable sharing, down in the comments. I read every one. Now, let's get back, because Eleanor Hayes is about to make a decision that will surprise everyone who thinks they know her, including herself. The trouble, when it came, did not come from Eleanor's doubt, though there was plenty of that to go around in the days that followed. It came, instead, from Ohio. The lawyer handling her aunt's estate wrote again, a second letter arriving on the same Tuesday's stage 2 weeks later, and this one was not about crates or deadlines. This one was about a cousin, a second cousin, really, on her father's side, a man named Harlan Griggs, whom Eleanor had met exactly twice in her life, both times at funerals, who had gotten wind, through channels Eleanor never did fully untangle, that the last unmarried woman of the family had settled herself in a frontier town without a single living relative to speak for her, and who had written to inform her, with the particular self-importance of a man who has appointed himself guardian of, a family he has otherwise shown no interest in, that it was neither proper nor safe, and that she ought to come back east where he had, as it happened, a position arranged for her as a companion to his elderly mother-in-law, a respectable situation for a woman in her circumstances. It was not an order. Harlan Griggs had no legal claim over Eleanor Hayes, and both of them knew it. But it was the kind of letter that lands harder than its actual authority warrants, precisely because it says out loud the thing a grieving, unmoored person has already been quietly asking herself in the dark, that a woman with no family left is a woman other people feel entitled to, a range that the very absence which had brought her to Millbrook made her, in the eyes of men like Harlan Griggs, a problem in need of solving by someone other than herself. Eleanor read the letter twice, standing in the mercantile with Ida Kessler watching her face carefully and asking no questions, and felt something old and familiar rise in her, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent her whole life being just independent enough to survive and never quite independent enough that people stop trying to place her somewhere. She did not answer Harlan Griggs that day. She did not tell Caleb about the letter either, not at first, and this, more than anything, was its own kind of tell, because Eleanor Hayes had never once, since the church steps, held something back from him that mattered. Ruth was the one who broke it open, in the end, though nobody could have planned it that way, because children rarely announce the moments that matter, and instead simply walk straight through the middle of them. It was a Wednesday, and Eleanor had come by the Whitfield place, an errand about a dress for the Harvest Social, or so she told herself, though the Harvest Social was still 3 weeks off, and the dress needed no urgent attention, and she was sitting on the porch step with Ruth, while Caleb worked at the far fence line, and Sarah played in the yard, and Ruth, with the abrupt and unguarded directness that only a 9-year-old can manage without seeming to know she said anything remarkable at all, looked up from a hem she was pretending to help with and said, "Are you going to stay?" Eleanor went very still. "I don't know what you mean," she said, which was not quite a lie and not quite the truth either. "Papa's been different since you started coming around," Ruth said, matter of fact, threading her needle the way Eleanor had shown her. "Sarah talks now. She didn't used to, not about Mama, not about anything much. She talks to you." Ruth looked up, and there was nothing manipulative in the look, nothing calculated, just a child stating a fact she had been carrying and had decided, finally, to set down where an adult could pick it up? I heard my Aunt Griggs wrote you a letter. Ida told Mrs. Pruitt, and Mrs. Pruitt told my Sunday school teacher, and she told me not to repeat it. So I'm not repeating it. I'm just asking, are you leaving? Eleanor did not answer right away. And in the silence, Sarah, silent, watchful Sarah, who had not asked a direct question about anything in nearly 2 years, stopped playing in the yard, walked up onto the porch, climbed up next to Eleanor without a word, and simply put her head against Eleanor's arm, the way a child does when she has decided, without needing to say so, exactly where she belongs. I don't know yet, Eleanor finally said, and her voice was not entirely steady. I have to think about it. Well, Ruth said, going back to her needle with the businesslike air of a child who has said the important thing and is now content to let the adults handle the rest, I hope you think about it fast, because Sarah's been asking Papa if you're going to be here for Christmas, and I don't think he knows what to tell her. Caleb came up from the fence line a few minutes later, hat in his hand, and found the three of them on the porch step in a configuration that stopped him mid-stride, his silent daughter leaning against a woman who was, by any reasonable accounting, still practically a stranger, and his older daughter watching him with a frank, assessing look at a child who has just done something enormous and has no idea, or perhaps every idea, of its size. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at him, and there was something in her face that had not been there before, not quite fear and not quite hope, but a particular unsteady place where those two things meet in a person who has been asked, without warning, to want something out loud. Harlan Griggs wrote to me, she said, before Caleb could ask anything at all. My father's cousin. He wants me to come east. He has a position arranged. Caleb did not move. And, he said, and I haven't answered him. Eleanor said, because I don't know how to explain to a man I've met twice in my life that I don't want a position arranged for me by people who only remembered I existed once they heard I might need managing. She looked down at Sarah, still leaning against her arm, and something in her voice caught and steadied itself in the same breath. I want to stay. I think I've wanted to stay for weeks and haven't let myself say it, because wanting things and losing them is a road I already know the shape of, and I wasn't sure I could survive walking it twice. She looked up at him in the porch, and the fence line beyond it, and the two girls between them went very quiet. The whole scene holding its breath the way a house holds its breath in the second before a decision is spoken aloud. But I'm saying it now, Eleanor said. I want to stay. I just don't know what that means, or what you're asking me to stay for, or whether wanting it is enough. Before we get to what happened next, because what happened next is the reason the story ends the way it ends, I want to introduce one more voice into this. Reverend Elias Cole had married half of Millbrook and buried the other half, and he had been watching Caleb Whitfield and Eleanor Hayes with particular attentiveness of a man whose entire profession consists of noticing what two people are too careful to say out loud. He had a question of his own, and it was coming, and it was the kind of question that would decide everything. Reverend Elias Cole found Caleb Whitfield the following Sunday, after the last of the congregation had scattered toward their wagons and their Sunday dinners, standing alone at the edge of the churchyard with his hat still in his hand, watching Eleanor across the yard help Ruth untangle a knot in her ribbon. Walk with me a minute, Cole said, and Caleb, who had known this man his whole life, who had been baptized by him and had his wedding performed by him and had, for years ago, stood in the same churchyard while Cole spoke words over grave that Caleb still could not fully remember without his chest going tight, fell into step beside him without argument. They walked along the fence line, past the hitching post, out to where the churchyard gave way to open field, and Cole did not speak again until they had gone some distance, the way a man walks when he is choosing his words with more care than usual. I've married a good number of people in this town, Cole said finally, and I've noticed something over the years about the ones who last and the ones who don't. It isn't the ones who are certain going in. Certainty doesn't hold up, not on its own. I've seen plenty of certain young couples come apart inside two winters. He glanced sideways at Caleb. It's the ones who understand what they're actually asking of each other. Do you understand what you're asking of her? Caleb was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. I'm asking her to be a mother to two girls who already lost one, he said. I'm asking her to build a life in a house that already has 4 years of somebody else's grief worked into the walls of it. I'm asking her to take on a fifth-generation cattle operation and a Montana winter and 2 children who are going to need things from her that I don't always know how to give them myself." He looked out over the field, toward the mountains, the same line of mountains Eleanor had looked at on the church steps 2 Sundays before. "I know exactly what I'm asking, Reverend. That's why I haven't asked it yet." Cole nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's gotten the answer he was hoping for, and needed to hear it plainly before he could say what came next. "And Sarah," he said, "does the girl understand what's being asked of her? Because a household doesn't get built by 2 adults deciding something in a churchyard. It gets built by everyone in the house agreeing to it, in their own way, on their own time. I'd want to know that child was ready before I stood up in front of this congregation and made it a matter of record." It was, Caleb would think later, the exact right question, asked by the exact right man, at the exact right moment, a question that did not doubt the rightness of the thing so much as insist to be built on ground solid enough to hold it. He did not answer Cole that day. He told him only that he intended to find out, and Cole said that was all any of them could rightly do, and put a hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder before turning back toward the church, leaving Caleb standing alone at the fence line with the question sitting in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it not yet done moving outward. He found his answer 4 days later, on a Thursday evening, and he did not go looking for it. It came to him the way the truest things always seemed to come to Caleb Whitfield that autumn, sideways, unplanned, in the middle of an ordinary evening he had not thought to prepare for. Eleanor had taken to coming by 2 or 3 evenings a week by then, no longer on the pretense of mending or ribbons, simply because the girls had begun to expect her and she had begun to expect the expecting. That Thursday she'd come to help with supper, and Caleb had been out of the barn later than he meant to be, seeing to a mare that was close to foaling, and by the time he came in, wiping his boots at the door the way he always did, the kitchen was warm with lamplight and the smell of biscuits, and he stopped in the doorway the way a man stops when something in a familiar room has changed in a way he can't immediately name. The table was set, for places, the way he always said it, out of habit he had never broken and never explained to anyone. But the 4th plate had not been moved to the sideboard. It sat where it always sat before he corrected it, across from Ruth beside Sarah, and Eleanor was standing at the stove with her back to him, entirely unaware that she had done anything worth remarking on, humming something low and tuneless while she checked the biscuits, having simply assumed, without asking and without being told, that the 4th plate belonged to her. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment and did not say anything at all, because there was nothing to say that would not have broken something fragile and exactly right about the sight of it. For years he had set that 4th plate and moved it before anyone could ask him why. For years it had sat between habit and hope, and now it sat between hope and something that no longer needed to hide his habit, because a woman who did not yet know what he'd been carrying had simply walked into his kitchen and set it down where it belonged, as if it had always belonged there, as if there had never been a single evening when it hadn't. He did not tell her that night what the plate meant. He would tell her eventually, much later, on a night when the telling would matter less because so much else had already been said and settled between them, and she would cry then in a way she had not let herself cry in the mercantile with the letter in her hands, and he would understand that this, the plate, more than the church steps, more than anything he'd said out loud, had been the moment the whole shape of his house changed for good. That was a Thursday. The Sunday that followed was the day Sarah spoke first. It happened at breakfast, ordinary as anything. Eleanor at the stove again, Ruth chattering about something to do with the Pruitt boy's dog, Caleb reading a letter about seed prices he had no real interest in, and Sarah, quiet, watchful Sarah, 6 years old and 2 years silent on one subject that mattered most in that house, looked up from her plate and said, without any drama at all, the way children say the enormous things, as if they were nothing, "Mama, can I have another biscuit?" The kitchen went very still. Ruth stopped talking mid-sentence. Caleb lowered the letter. Eleanor at the stove went rigid for exactly 1 second, her hand pausing over the pan, and then, because she understood, faster than anyone in that kitchen, the precise and terrible fragility of the moment, understood that if she made too much of the word might retreat back wherever it had been hiding for 2 years and never come out again. She simply said, in the same easy voice she'd have used for anything, "Of course you can," and set another biscuit on Sarah's plate, and went back to the stove as if nothing at all remarkable had happened. Sarah ate her biscuit. Ruth, after a beat, went back to talking about the dog. And Caleb Whitfield sat at his own table with a letter about seed prices forgotten in his hand and felt something break open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 4 years, watching his silent daughter call a woman mama over breakfast as though she had been doing it her whole life, as though the word had simply been waiting, patient as anything, for a mouth willing to say it and an ear ready to receive it without flinching. He did not trust himself to speak for a moment. When he did, all he said was, "Pass the honey, would you, Ruth?" in a voice that came out rougher than he intended, and Ruth passed the honey. And nobody in that kitchen said another word about what had just happened, because some things, once spoken, do not need to be spoken about again. They only need to be allowed to stand. Eleanor wrote to Harlan Griggs that same week. It was a short letter, and she showed it to no one before she sent it. But she told Caleb, some while after, that she had written that she was grateful for his concern, and that she would not be requiring his arrangements, because she had found, in a town he had never heard of and would likely never visit, exactly the family she had believed herself to have lost for good. Caleb and Eleanor were married the second Saturday of December in the Millbrook Church, with Reverend Cole presiding and the whole congregation crowded into pews, still cold from the walk over, because the little stove at the back of the church never did keep up with a Montana morning. Ruth stood beside Eleanor holding a small bundle of dried wildflowers Eleanor had helped her gather back in October and pressed and kept for exactly this purpose, though neither of them had said so at the time. Sarah, 6 years old, sat in the front pew between Ida Kessler and the Reverend's wife, and when the moment came for Cole to ask whether anyone present had cause to object, it was Sarah, small and solemn and entirely unprompted, who said, in a voice that carried further than a 6-year-old's voice generally does, "Nobody. She's already my mama." And the whole church laughed, and half of it cried, and Reverend Cole, who had married a great many people in that building, said afterward it was the finest objection to an objection he'd ever heard. They did not leave Millbrook for a honeymoon, because there was a farm to run and a winter coming on, and neither of them minded in the least. Eleanor's boxes from Ohio, the ones the freight man had shipped up from her aunt's house, were finally fully unpacked by the following spring. The Bible went on the shelf beside Caleb's own family Bible. The good silver spoon went into the kitchen drawer and was used, eventually, without ceremony, for Sunday dinners, and the small wooden box of letters, read through at last, was kept in the bottom drawer of the bureau in the room that had once been only Caleb's, and was never spoken of as a sad thing again, only as a thing that happened and mattered, and was carried now by more than one set of shoulders. The mailbox at the end of the lane was repainted that spring, the name on it no longer just Whitfield but the family's name in full, and when Ruth started at the schoolhouse the following autumn under a different teacher, for by then Eleanor had set aside her needle for a season, expecting a baby that would arrive the following winter, a boy they would name Elias, after the Reverend who had asked the right question at the right time. The enrollment form asked for the child's mother's name, and Ruth, filling it in herself with the careful, improving handwriting Eleanor had spent a year helping her with, wrote Eleanor Whitfield without a single moment's hesitation, as though there had never been any other name that could possibly have gone in that space. On a spring evening the following year, Caleb came in from the north pasture to find the whole family on the porch, Eleanor with baby Elias against her shoulder, Ruth reading aloud from a book to Sarah, who leaned against her sister's side the exact way she'd once leaned against Eleanor's arm on this very porch, in this very light, the day everything had started to turn. The kitchen table behind them, visible through the open door, was set for supper, for places, and then, since the winter, a fifth, and none of them had ever once needed to be moved to the sideboard, because there was no longer a single plate at that table that didn't belong to somebody sitting down to eat. Caleb came up the steps and sat beside his wife without saying anything, the way he had learned, over that first autumn, that some evenings didn't need words to be exactly right, and Eleanor kept reading over Ruth's shoulder, correcting a word here and there, and the Montana evening held all 5 of them the way it had once held only 3, the mountains going purple at the edges, the fence line dark against the last of the light, the house behind them warm and lived in, and entirely, finally, full. She had told him once that she had no family left. He had told her his kids had been waiting for a mother. Neither one of them, standing on that church step in October gold light with a hawk overhead, had known the whole shape of what those 2 sentences would build. they had only known in that moment that the truest thing available to either of them needed saying, and that saying it was worth whatever came after. That's the whole of it, really, when you get down to the center of it. We tell ourselves family is a thing that happens to us, or doesn't, that it's fixed the day we're born and then either kept or lost, and never built again from nothing. But I don't believe that, and I don't think this story believes it either. Eleanor Hayes had every reason to believe her family was a closed book, finished, buried, done. Caleb Whitfield had every reason to believe 4 years of careful silence was simply what the rest of his life was going to look like. And instead, one of them found the courage to say the hardest true sentence she had, "I have no family left." And the other found courage to answer it, not with comfort, not with pity, but when offered just as true and just as frightened to say out loud. That's the part one want you to sit with, not the wedding, not the biscuit at breakfast. As much as that one gets me every time, the sentence itself, the willingness to say the true thing when the safe thing would have been so much easier. If there's a sentence you've been carrying, something true you haven't said to somebody who's waiting to hear it, I hope this story is a nudge that finally gets it said. Thank you for riding along with me tonight. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you were here. Until next time, keep riding.